The elevator broke on a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because Tuesdays were the days I stayed an extra hour to cross-reference the quarterly lease renewals against the compliance calendar. It was late November, close to 8 in the evening, and the building had that particular kind of quiet that only comes when almost everyone else has gone home. The kind of quiet where you can hear the ventilation system cycling through its rhythms and the faint sound of your own footsteps feels louder than it should. I had been working at Hargrove Property Management for 14 months by then. I took the position about 8 weeks after my husband Gerald died. The pension from his years at the Transit Authority covered the basics, but not comfortably, and I had never been someone who sat well with financial uncertainty. Gerald had handled most of our household accounts. That was just how we had divided things over 31 years, and neither of us had thought to change it. After he was gone, I realized quickly that I needed to understand our finances more directly. Working helped me do that. It gave me structure, and at 63, structure was what I needed more than comfort. The job was simple enough. Evening shift, basement archive, organizing physical and scanned records for the company's rental properties across the Chicago metro area, lease agreements, maintenance logs, legal dispute files, the kind of paperwork that companies keep because they have to, not because anyone expects to look at it again. I want to tell you something about the first week I was there, because it matters later. I built an indexing system, not because anyone asked me to, but because the existing system was inconsistent. And inconsistency makes retrieval slow, and slow retrieval creates gaps in documentation. Clifford Baines, the daytime manager, saw what I had done at the end of my first week. He stood in the doorway of the archive room, looked at the reorganized shelves, and said, with the particular flatness of a man who doesn't like being made to feel behind, "Just make sure nothing gets moved that shouldn't be moved." Then he left. I remember thinking that was an odd response to competence, but I filed it away and kept working. Thomas Greer worked the security desk near the underground parking exit, retired city worker, supplementing his own pension, much the same as me. We had started talking the way people do when they share the same quiet hours in the same building. I began bringing 2 cups of tea and a small thermos around 7:30. He walked me to my car before I left each night. It took maybe 5 minutes. We talked about the weather, about his daughter's school plays, about a documentary one of us had watched. Nothing important. Just a small piece of company at the end of a long evening. At the time, I didn't think much about how those 5 minutes had become the steadiest part of my day. That Tuesday, I loaded the elevator with 2 archive boxes and my bag, pressed the button for the parking level, and the elevator made a sound I had not heard before. A low mechanical hesitation, followed by a click, and then nothing. The doors opened again on the basement floor. The elevator was out of service. I left the boxes near the archive room door and took the stairwell to the parking level, which meant entering through a different corridor than usual. The door from the stairwell opened about 40 feet from the security desk, rather than directly in front of it. I heard the voices before I turned the corner. There were 2 of them. Young men I did not recognize. They were standing near the exterior door, not the parking area itself, and Thomas was not at his desk. One of them was leaning against the wall in a way that suggested he had been there for some time. The other was looking at his phone. I stopped where I was. I waited. I did not move forward. I stood in the corridor and simply listened. Then Thomas appeared from around the far corner, moving quickly, and when he saw me standing there, he stopped. Something crossed his face. Relief, I thought at the time, though I didn't yet understand why. He walked toward me, and without raising his voice said, "I'm glad you came this way tonight." He didn't explain. He walked me to my car as usual. I drove home. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was frightened, exactly, but because I understood, in the way you understand things you cannot yet prove, that the elevator braking had mattered in some way. I hadn't worked out. and I understood something else, something I hadn't let myself think clearly until that moment in the dark of my apartment. This had been building for longer than one Tuesday evening. I have always been someone who notices small things before I understand why they matter. Gerald used to say I had the memory of an accountant and the patience of a librarian. He meant it as a compliment. He was not always precise with his words, but he was always sincere. I thought about that description often in the weeks after that Tuesday, when I found myself watching the parking level more carefully each evening, not with alarm, just with the particular attention you give something when it has introduced a question it hasn't yet answered. Thomas didn't bring up what had happened. Neither did I. But I noticed that he began sitting slightly differently at his desk after that night, angled toward the stairwell door rather than straight ahead. It was a small adjustment, the kind a person makes without announcing it. I want to go back a little, because what came next only makes sense if you understand how certain things had already been settling into place. The first memory I want to mention is from about 4 months before the elevator broke. It was a Friday in early July, still light outside when I arrived for my shift, the kind of summer evening in Chicago, where the heat sits in the air, even after the sun has moved. I was in the archive room pulling files related to a property dispute in Pilsen when I found a folder misfiled under the wrong tenant number. Inside were lease addendums for a building on the west side, along with a handwritten note on company letterhead. The note referenced a payment arrangement that wasn't reflected in any of the official records I had been given to maintain. I remember holding the folder and reading the note twice. I could smell the particular combination of old paper and the cleaning solution they used on the basement floors. I set the folder on the work table, smoothed it flat, and read it a third time. Then I refiled it exactly where I had found it and wrote down the file number in my personal notebook. Just the number, nothing else. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Misfiled documents were not unusual, but I kept the file number. The second memory is from about 6 weeks later, late August. I was waiting by the security desk for Thomas when a man came through the lobby corridor. His name, I would later learn, was Raymond Coyle. He was a consultant of some kind, connected to the company's property acquisition side, though his exact role was never made clear to me through any official channel. He was well dressed, always in the same style of dark suit regardless of the weather, and he carried a leather portfolio that I never saw him open in anyone's presence. He moved through the building with the particular confidence of someone who has decided, in advance, that rooms belong to him when he enters them. He stopped when he saw me and said, with a kind of easy authority that I recognized as practiced rather than natural, "You're the archive woman, right?" I said yes. He looked at me for a moment, in a way that was not quite rude, but was not quite respectful either. His eyes moved briefly to the thermos in my hand and then back to my face, the way a person glances at something they've already categorized. Then he said, "Good. Just make sure things stay where they are." He kept walking. Thomas came off his call. We walked to the parking garage. I didn't mention the exchange, and Thomas didn't ask about it. That was the moment I understood, or began to understand, that someone in that building was aware of what was in those files, and that they had made a point of reminding me, without quite saying so, that my role was maintenance, not inquiry. I didn't argue. I didn't respond with anything beyond a nod. But I went home that night and added a second notation in my personal notebook. Not just the file number this time. The date, the time, a physical description of Raymond Coyle, and his exact words as I remembered them. Verbatim. The third memory is from October, about a month before the elevator incident. I was eating lunch in the small break room on the basement level when two of the daytime administrative staff came in, not noticing me in the corner. They were mid-conversation. I heard one of them say, in a low voice, "She's just temporary. Clifford said she won't be here past the new year." The other one said, "Does she know that?" The first one shrugged and opened the refrigerator. I sat quietly and finished my sandwich. The room was small, and the fluorescent light above the sink made a faint buzzing sound that I had stopped noticing weeks ago, but heard clearly in that moment. After they left, I sat for another few minutes. I thought about what it means to be told you are temporary in a place where you have been doing careful, consistent work. I thought about Gerald, and about the pension, and about the notebook in my bag. I also thought, honestly, about whether I was reading too much into things, whether a misfiled folder and a dismissive consultant and a break room conversation added up to anything real, or whether grief had made me alert to threats that weren't there. I sat with that question for a while. I didn't resolve it that evening, but I wrote the break room conversation in my notebook anyway. Because documentation costs nothing and doubt is not the same as being wrong. Then I called my husband's former attorney, a woman named Patricia Owens, and asked her to recommend someone who handled workplace documentation and labor matters. She gave me a name. I wrote it down. The office of Martin Calhoun, employment and contract attorney, was on the 14th floor of a building on West Madison Street. I went on a Thursday morning, my day off, wearing the grey wool coat I had bought the winter before Gerald got sick. I don't know why I remember the coat specifically. Maybe because putting it on that morning felt like a decision rather than just getting dressed. The waiting room was quiet. Dark wood furniture, a small table with a water pitcher and paper cups, a window that looked out over the street below where people were moving quickly against the cold. A paralegal named Diane brought me a cup of coffee without asking whether I wanted one, which I appreciated. I sat with it and waited. Martin Calhoun was in his mid-50s, methodical in the way people become after years of reading documents for a living. He did not rush. He let me speak without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. I told him about the job, about the misfiled folder, about Raymond Coyle and what he had said, about the conversation I had overheard in the break room, about Clifford Baines and the oddly flat response to a filing system that had made his archive room function better than it had in years. I told him about the notebook. I had brought it with me, and I placed it on his desk when I referenced it. He read through my notations carefully. He asked 2 clarifying questions. Then he set the notebook down and looked at me in a way that was not dramatic, but was direct. He said, "You're not a temporary contractor, Mrs. Ellis. You were hired as a part-time employee of record. That's a different classification with different protections. What you were told in that break room, if accurate, would represent a termination plan being discussed without proper notice procedure." I said I understood. He said, "And the man who spoke to you in the corridor, if he's connected to the files you're describing, and if those files contain payment records that don't match official documentation, then someone has already assessed that you might have seen something they'd prefer you hadn't." I said. That was my read as well. He asked if I had made copies of anything. I told him I had not copied anything. I had only documented what I observed, in my own notebook, using my own words. He nodded slowly at that. He said, "That was the right instinct. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was reassuring, exactly, but because it confirmed that I had not been imagining a pattern. I had been reading one correctly. We talked for another 40 minutes. He explained my employee classification protections. He explained that the informal note I had found could be relevant to a compliance matter, depending on its content. He was careful not to overstate what he knew, but he was also careful not to understate it. Before I left, he said something I wrote down in the notebook that evening. He said, "You're not the person on the outside of this situation looking for a way in. You're already inside it. That changes your position considerably." I thanked him for his time. Diane validated my parking. I walked back to my car in the cold and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The paperwork already had my name on it, in a sense. I had signed an employment agreement. I was a party to a documented relationship with that company. Whatever they had decided about me informally, in break rooms and corridor conversations, had not changed what existed on paper. That was the procedural turning point, not dramatic, not loud, just the quiet recognition that the structure of the situation was different from how it had been presented to me. I drove home, made lunch, and called Martin Calhoun's office to retain him formally. Diane sent the engagement letter by email that afternoon. I printed it, signed it, scanned it, and sent it back. Then I made a second call to the Illinois Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division and requested information about documentation requirements for informal payment arrangements in property management. Companies operating in Cook County. The person I spoke with was professional and thorough. I took notes. That evening I went to work as usual. I brought the thermos. Thomas and I had our 5 minutes. He walked me to my car. He mentioned his daughter had a winter concert coming up at her school. I told him I hoped the weather held. I said nothing about the attorney or the calls. I just went home and slept better than I had in weeks. The following Monday, I arrived at work to find that my archive access card had been deactivated. I discovered this at 7:14 in the evening, standing in front of the basement archive room door with both hands full, the thermos tucked under one arm, the card reader blinking red. I stood there for a moment. I did not knock or call out. I set the thermos down on the floor, took out my phone, and photographed the red indicator light, the door, and the timestamp on my phone screen in the same frame. Then I picked up the thermos and went to find Clifford Baines. He was in his office on the second floor, which was unusual for that hour. He looked up when I appeared in his doorway, with an expression that I recognized as prepared. He had been expecting me to come to him. That told me something. He said the card deactivation was a system update, a routine security reset. He said my card would be reactivated by morning. I said, "I'll need that in writing before I leave tonight." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "That's not really necessary, Margaret." I said, "I understand, but I'd like it in writing." There was a pause, the kind of pause that has weight in it. He printed a short note on company letterhead, signed it, and handed it across the desk. I thanked him, folded it, and placed it in my bag. I went back downstairs, sat in the break room, and documented the entire exchange in my notebook. Time, location, his exact words, my exact words, the note he had provided. That same evening, I forwarded a brief summary to Martin Calhoun by email. Not a complaint. Just a factual account, time-stamped, with the photograph attached. Martin replied the following morning with 3 words. He wrote, "Keep doing this." 2 days later, I received a call from my son, Daniel. He lived in Columbus, and we spoke perhaps once every 2 or 3 weeks. He called on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. He generally called on Sunday evenings. He said he had heard I was having some trouble at work. I asked him how he had heard that. He said someone from the company had reached out to him. He didn't say who. He said they were concerned about me, that they felt I might be under some stress following Gerald's death, and that perhaps the evening shifts were becoming difficult. I sat with that for a moment. I was in my kitchen. The afternoon light was coming through the window over the sink at a low angle, the way it does in November, laying a pale strip across the linoleum floor. I said, "Daniel, who contacted you specifically?" He said he didn't want to get into it. He said he just thought I should know that people were worried. I said, "I appreciate you telling me. I'm fine. I'm handling some things carefully, and I'd rather not discuss the details right now, but I want you to know there's nothing to worry about." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, you don't have to fight everything alone." I said, "I know that. This isn't a fight." We spoke for a few more minutes about his daughter's soccer season and then said goodbye. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. I thought about what it means when a company reaches out, not to an attorney, not to a regulatory body, but to a family member. It means they are looking for a soft point. a way to apply pressure through someone who cares about you rather than through any official channel. That was the mistake. Not because it made me angry, but because it told me clearly that whatever was in those misfiled files was significant enough to justify that kind of lateral pressure, informal enough to avoid official channels, targeted enough to find Daniel's number. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. There was a night, around that time, maybe 2 days after Daniel's call, when I almost stopped. I sat at the kitchen table, at close to midnight, with the manila folder in front of me, and I thought seriously about putting it in the drawer, reducing my hours, and letting the whole thing settle into the background of my life, the way unpleasant things sometimes do when you decide they aren't worth the cost. I was 63 years old. I was tired. Gerald was gone. The apartment was quiet in a way that still surprised me some evenings, and I thought, with genuine uncertainty, what if I've read this wrong? What if Clifford Baines is simply a poor manager, and Raymond Coyle is simply a rude man, and none of it connects the way I think it does? I sat with that for a long time. Then I thought about the notebook, about the file number I had written down in July without fully knowing why, about the employment agreement with my name on it, about Martin Calhoun saying, without drama, that was the right instinct. I closed the folder. I went to bed. In the morning, I called Martin's office and told him I was ready to proceed. The following Friday, I met with Martin again. He had done background research on Hargrove property management and set 3 documents on the desk between us. The first was a state business registration, showing a subsidiary LLC, registered under a slightly different name, not disclosed in any tenant-facing materials I had worked with. The second was a public court record from 4 years prior, involving a lease dispute in which an informal payment arrangement had been cited as evidence of a side agreement outside the primary contract. The third was a copy of my original employment agreement. He pointed to a clause near the bottom of the second page, a record's confidentiality provision. Standard language, he said, but broad enough that the company might argue it covered my personal notations. He said, "They may try to use this." I said, "Can they?" He said, "They can try, but your notations don't reproduce any company document. They record your own observations in your own words. That's a meaningful distinction." He paused. "It's also why what you've been doing is legally sound. You didn't take anything. You just paid attention." I nodded. The room was quiet for a moment. Then I asked him what the next step was. He said, "We file a formal inquiry with the Illinois Department of Labor regarding your employment classification and the access card incident. That creates an official record. Once there's an official record, certain things become considerably harder for them to do quietly." I said, "File it." I drove home in the early dark of a Chicago November evening. The streets were wet from an earlier rain, and the lights reflected in long streaks across the pavement. I stopped at the grocery store and bought soup ingredients and a small bunch of chrysanthemums for the kitchen table, because Gerald used to bring them home on Fridays, and I had gotten back into the habit. That Sunday, Daniel called at his usual time. He didn't mention the company again. I didn't bring it up. We talked about Thanksgiving, about whether he and the family might make the drive up to Chicago this year. Before we hung up, he said, quietly, "I looked up Hargrove online. Mom, I saw some things." I said, "I know." He said, "Okay." And then, after a pause, "You've got this," I said. "I know that too." The formal inquiry was filed on a Thursday morning in the first week of December. I know the exact date because Martin's office sent me a confirmation by email at 9:47 in the morning, and I printed it and added it to the folder I had been keeping at home. Not a digital folder, a physical one, manila, labeled with the date I had started it and kept in the second drawer of the filing cabinet Gerald had used for household documents. I had cleared his papers carefully after he died, kept what mattered, and the drawer had been mostly empty since then. It felt appropriate to use it for this. The inquiry went to the Illinois Department of Labor and copied the state's Attorney General's office, which Martin explained was standard procedure when the filing touched on potential financial irregularities in addition to the employment classification question. He was precise about the language. He said the filing did not make accusations. It asked questions through official channels and requested documentation. That distinction, he said, was important. Questions through official channels require official responses. That is a different kind of pressure than an argument. I went to work that Thursday evening, as I always did. Nothing looked different. Clifford Baines was not in the building when I arrived. My access card worked without difficulty. The archive room was exactly as I had left it the previous shift. Thomas was at his desk. I brought the thermos. He poured his cup and told me his daughter's winter concert had been moved to the following Wednesday because of a scheduling conflict with the gymnasium. He seemed pleased about the extra time to practice, or at least pleased that she was pleased. I told him I hoped it went well. I worked through my shift without incident, sorted and cross-referenced, made my usual notations in the archive log, left at 9:15. The following Monday, Clifford Baines called me at home. I did not answer. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message asking me to come in 30 minutes early on Wednesday for a brief meeting regarding my schedule going forward. His voice was measured. Professional. The kind of professional that is performed rather than natural, the way it had been in his office the night of the access card. I listened to the message twice. Then I called Martin and left him a message describing it. Martin called back within the hour. He said, "Don't go in early. Respond by text, in writing, that you're available to meet during your scheduled shift hours and that you'd like to know the subject matter of the meeting in advance so you can prepare accordingly. Keep the language polite and plain." I sent that text at 2 in the afternoon. Clifford did not respond until the following morning. He wrote that the meeting was regarding a schedule review and that it would only take a few minutes. I showed Martin the exchange. He said, "We'll send a short letter today, informing them that as a matter of procedure, given the active inquiry with the Department of Labor, you've been advised to have any employment-related discussions documented in writing or conducted with your attorney present." I said, "Will that alarm them?" He looked at me steadily and said, "Mrs. Ellis, they are already alarmed. That letter just tells them you know that." The letter went out that afternoon. I did not hear from Clifford Baines again directly. What happened instead was quieter and, in some ways, more telling. Over the following week and a half, I noticed small changes in the building. The daytime administrative staff, who had previously moved past me in the hallway without acknowledgement, began making brief eye contact. Not warmly, just registering me differently. The man in the well-pressed suit, who had told me to keep things where they were, did not appear in the building during any of my shifts. I noted his absence in my notebook without commentary. Then, on a Tuesday evening, exactly 3 weeks after the formal inquiry was filed, Martin called me at home with news. The Department of Labor had made contact with Hargrove Property Management, requesting employment classification documentation for all part-time evening staff, hired in the past 24 months. Standard in scope, he said, but broad enough to require a significant response. At the same time, the Attorney General's office had sent a separate and unrelated letter. He emphasized, unrelated, to the company's registered LLC subsidiary, requesting documentation of financial arrangements associated with 3 specific properties in Cook County. He said, "The second letter is a coincidence in timing, but it isn't a coincidence in context. Someone else had already been looking at that subsidiary. Your inquiry gave them a useful entry point." I sat with that. I was at the kitchen table again. It was late, close to 10, and the apartment was quiet the way it gets in December, when the windows are sealed against the cold and the street sounds are muffled. I had a cup of tea that had gone slightly cool while I was listening. I said, "What does that mean for my employment?" He said, "It means that terminating you right now would be the single worst decision they could make. Any adverse action against you during an active inquiry creates a retaliation exposure that no competent attorney would allow their client to take on." I said, "So I keep going to work," he said. "You keep going to work." I finished my tea. I washed the cup. I went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept without difficulty. What I remember most about that period is not the legal details. It is the quality of the quiet. There is a difference between the quiet of someone who has nothing to say and the quiet of someone who has already said what needed to be said in the right place to the right people. I had spent most of my life confusing the two. That winter, I finally understood the difference. The resolution did not arrive like an ending. It arrived the way most true things do, gradually, and then all at once in a way that felt smaller than you expected. In the second week of January, Martin called to tell me that Hargrove Property Management had settled the employment classification inquiry without contest. My status was formally confirmed as a part-time employee of record. The settlement included a written acknowledgement that the access card deactivation had not followed proper procedure, and a modest adjustment to my compensation, reflecting the correct classification tier for the hours I had worked over the prior 14 months. It was not a large amount, but it was documented, official, and final. The LLC subsidiary matter was handled separately, by parties and processes that had nothing directly to do with me. Martin explained that my initial inquiry had contributed to a larger review that was already underway through channels I had never been part of and would never fully know the details of. I was a data point, he said, in something bigger. I told him that was fine. I had never needed to be the center of it. Raymond Coyle, I learned through Martin some weeks later, had quietly separated from his consulting arrangement with Hargrove sometime in December. No announcement. No explanation offered to anyone I knew. He was simply no longer in the building. I thought about the leather portfolio. I had never seen him open. I thought about the way he had looked at me in that corridor, the brief glance at the thermos in my hand, the practiced authority in his voice. I wondered if he had ever genuinely considered that the archive woman might be paying the kind of attention that outlasts convenience. Probably not. That was, in the end, the central miscalculation. I worked my shift the night the settlement confirmation arrived. I brought the thermos. Thomas poured his cup. His daughter's winter concert had gone well, he said. She had a small solo and had not been nervous, which surprised him more than it had surprised her. I told him that sometimes the people we worry about know themselves better than we give them credit for. He smiled at that. We walked to my car. The temperature had dropped sharply, and our breath showed in the air, and the parking garage had that particular cold smell of concrete in winter, faintly metallic, that I have always associated with the end of a long day. Before I got in the car, he said, quietly, "I'm glad you came through the stairwell that night." I said, "So am I." He nodded once and went back inside. I sat in the car for a moment before starting it. The garage was empty and still. I thought about Gerald and about the filing cabinet and about the drawer that now held a neat manila folder with a documented record of 14 months of careful attention. I thought about Daniel, who had called on Christmas morning and talked for nearly an hour, longer than he had in years. He had asked me to explain what had happened, and I had, plainly and without drama. And he had listened the way adults listen when they realize they underestimated someone. He said, near the end of the call, "I didn't know you knew how to do all of that." I said, "Neither did I, entirely. I just knew how to pay attention and write things down." In February, I submitted a formal commendation to building management on Thomas Greer's behalf, documenting his consistent professionalism and his practice of walking evening staff to their vehicles, I cited specific dates and described his conduct in plain, factual language. I sent a copy to Martin for my own records. I don't know what came of it officially, but I know it existed, in writing, attached to his name. That felt like enough. I stayed at Hargrove through the spring. In April, Clifford Baines left the company. I was not told the reason. I did not ask. By June, I had enough financial clarity from the settlement adjustment and Gerald's pension structure that I was able to reduce my hours to 3 evenings a week. I used the extra time to take a bookkeeping course at the community college on Tuesday mornings. It was practical. It was also something I had wanted to do for years, without quite admitting it. The last thing I want to say is this. I did not set out to be someone who fights. I am not, by nature, a person who enjoys conflict or seeks it. What I learned that winter was something quieter and more durable. I learned that institutions respond to documentation the way weather responds to pressure systems. Not dramatically, not immediately, but reliably, over time, according to their own internal logic. I also learned that the people who try to make you feel small rarely do so because they have assessed you accurately. They do it because smallness, in others, is convenient for them. The moment you stop cooperating with that convenience, the entire arrangement has to be renegotiated. I didn't win, exactly. I just stopped losing quietly. The elevator in that building was repaired within a week of breaking. I rode it every shift after that without incident. But I never stopped using the stairwell occasionally, on nights when I felt like it. Old habits, once they prove their value, tend to stay with you. Silence is not permission. I know that now in a way I didn't, before Gerald died. Before that Tuesday in November. Before I started paying the kind of attention that turns observation into record, and record into standing. If stories about quiet boundaries and the kind of dignity that lives in documentation rather than volume mean something to you, you're welcome to stay.